Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking Cecilia and Juliet for inviting me to present this work today. My presentation to you today is based on a piece of research that I think some of you know about. It was a report issued by the Center for Work-Life Policy that I was privileged to be a part of. And the report was called The Athena Factor, Reversing the Brain Drain in Science, Engineering, and Technology. So it's a little bit broader than what folks have been talking about today because it includes science. Engineering is kind of a crossover, but I think you'll see from the data that there's a lot of parallels. And also I'm trying to amplify today the technology piece because that's what we're here to talk about. So in the spring of 2006, the Center for Work-Life Policy launched a research project targeting women with degrees in SET who had pursued corporate careers. And we knew, both anecdotally and from some research that had been done, that men far outnumbered women in these sectors in corporate America and globally. A lot of research had been done about women in academia, but much less on women in the corporate sector. So this project, the Athena Factor Project, which was named to honor the Greek goddess of wisdom, who was a fierce warrior as well as a great intellect, set out to try to fill that knowledge gap. So over an 18-month period, the research team fielded 4 major surveys of women, telephone surveys, and men, and conducted 28 focus groups across the US and the UK, Switzerland, China, and Australia. And the data sets that resulted from that work gives us a sharper perspective on the problem than we had previously. And I'm going to try, given from what I've heard today and what I know about went on yesterday, to not do too much repeating, because one of the things that's quite interesting from what I've heard is that there is a lot of overlap and complementarity between the work that we're presenting. So I'm going to just begin by describing the nature of the problem. And at its simplest, the piece of this issue that we're focusing on is that although many women enter SET fields, huge numbers abandon their jobs mid-career. So we really tried to focus on that moment of abandonment. Next, I'll outline the causal factors that underlie that huge attrition. And I'll end with some examples of how some leading-edge firms are trying to address it. And those are things that we have talked about, so I won't spend too much time on that. So let's take a look at what we found. Starting with the good news. Perhaps the most important finding from our research is that lots of young women out there aspire to careers in SET. More than 40% of highly qualified scientists, engineers, and technologists on the lower rungs of corporate ladders are women. We know that young girls and young women face a range of obstacles in the educational system and in our culture that make it difficult to embrace and pursue their interests. But despite those obstacles, a large number of them persevere. Where does this drive come from? And what are the motivating factors that keep women, young girls, on those paths? Well, we had an interesting conversation in the morning breakout session about this. Our research shows that more than any other factor, these women choose their careers because they're deeply interested in contributing to society. So this goes counter to what some people were saying this morning. But we found that 63%, for example, of female scientists enter the field because of that desire. And other SET women find their work intellectually stimulating and exciting. They enjoy grappling with new ideas, being on the cutting edge, and driving innovation. But most importantly, they appreciate being able to use their skills and knowledge, which in many cases have taken years to acquire, to improve the lot of humankind. And in the work, we call that an Athena trait. On average, we found that men were more interested in money and power, but for women in SET, the desire to give back was a more powerful motivator than money. So that's the good news, or maybe the exciting news. But the downside is that the SET woman's altruism can put her at odds with the business demands of the environment and create one more source of isolation and stress. So we've seen the tremendous potential for young women in technology and other SET careers, but as we look at what happens to these women over time, we see a different and disturbing pattern emerging. Although a healthy number of women start out in SET careers, quit rates are huge. More than half of these women ultimately leave their private sector SET jobs. And while some of them move to the government or nonprofit sector or become self-employed because those jobs are thought to be perhaps more forgiving, fully 1/4 of SET women abandon their training entirely. Note that the quit rates are highest in technology. This is an enormous waste of talent and investment. So the next slide here tries to really drill down deeper to get a better understanding of the dynamics. And what we found is that there's a very noticeable point at which the drop-off becomes pronounced. Female attrition from SET careers spikes between the ages of 35 and 40. What's going on in women's lives around that time? Second child often, sometimes first child. And it's also, and you'll notice that the green line, the bottom one, it's hard to see the colors here, this line, has the steepest downward slope. That's the tech sector. So why should we care about this? Well, at the time that women choose to leave, they've invested an enormous amount in themselves. They're leaving careers that they entered with great enthusiasm, and their companies have invested a great deal in them. So from the corporate perspective, there are clear reasons for caring about this and for taking action. Labor shortages in SET are worsening. We've talked about that a little bit. But whether you look at it from the individual or the corporate perspective, the enormous quit rate is very unfortunate. So what's driving it? And why does it become most severe just when women are beginning to break into the upper ranks of management? Well, our research uncovered 5 factors, what we call antigens, that operate to drive women out of SET jobs. They are hostile macho cultures, extreme work pressures, isolation, mysterious career paths, and systems of risk and reward. So I'm going to take a few minutes to walk you through each of these and its effect on women's career decisions. The first antigen concerns hostile or macho cultures that permeate many SET workplaces. The women we spoke with described a culture that was unsupportive and that excluded them from the places that real business happens. This exclusion consists of physical exclusion, after hours at the lab or the smelter, after work at the bar or the golf course, that denies women access to vital information. And women also told us that they were pushed out by the demeaning and degrading behavior of the men with whom they worked. So those behaviors exacerbate the isolation that comes with being the only women on the team or at a work site. Let me tell you about a woman we called Sarah, a young technologist who had stellar performance ratings when we talked to her and was being groomed by her company for a top job. So Sarah told us, quote, "I'm used to being the only woman in the room, but I can't get used to the vulgarities. I have a son and I would never want him to behave like this, constantly using foul language and sexual innuendos. It makes me not want to participate on team projects. When I talked to the VP of HR about this, human resources, I was told, you can't succeed and maintain your way of doing things. You have to try harder to become one of the boys." So 63% of women in SET fields told us that they had experienced sexual harassment. 63% of women that we surveyed. In addition, more than 1/4 of women in tech and engineering believe that they are seen as intrinsically less capable than their male peers. So what do women do to cope? Some told us that they adopt stereotypical masculine attitudes and attributes in order to succeed. In short, they begin to behave like the men. They start telling the dirty jokes and those sorts of things too. Behaving like the men can be as simple as one woman told us, not wearing skirts and makeup in order to increase her credibility at work. But behaving like the men can also create greater isolation. It doesn't grant one entree into the old boys club, but it may well create distrust and distance from other women. We had some focus groups, and we usually split the women into kind of the younger cohort and a more advanced cohort. And women were often uncomfortable when they first came into the room, and some of them told us, you know, nothing important ever happens when it's only women, right? So there was this sense that they might be wasting their time by being in a room with only other women. The next antigen is isolation. By the time SET women get anywhere near the top, they're a tiny minority in most companies. They're often the only woman in the meeting, on the team, on the floor. We actually spoke with one woman who told us she had to go down 3 floors in her building just to find a women's bathroom. And our research shows that fully 1/3 of women in private sector SET jobs, and more than that in tech, feel extremely isolated at work. The isolation of women in SET is both a cause and a consequence of the lack of female role models, mentors, and sponsors in these companies. And precisely because there are so few women at executive levels, it's hard for women climbing the corporate ladder to find enough role models, mentors, and sponsors to support them. But without that support, it's impossible for them to reach the upper levels, which leaves the next generation of women professionals in the same position. So it's a vicious cycle that's happening. Isolation takes a toll on job satisfaction and engagement, too, and women who are not satisfied with their job are 22 times more likely to leave. As one female executive at a tech firm told us, quote, "When you're isolated, it takes a huge amount of energy just to maintain your footing." In other words, isolation itself creates a flight risk. Only 2% of the women we surveyed were in upper-level management positions. We have one positive note to report here, and that is that in the rare SET context where there are significant numbers of women in management, a different story starts to unfold. Our data show that women managers have a tremendously positive effect on other women. Although other research shows that the tipping point is something like 20%, our research found that SET fields are so male-dominated that a mere 10% of women in management makes a critical difference. On the one hand, 10% is 5 times more managers, upper-level managers, than the average number in our survey. But on the other hand, once the proportion of managers who are female crosses the 10% line, all of the key variables start to change. Suddenly, women feel less isolated, have an easier time accessing role models, and feel that they can talk more about work-life issues in a more open way. The next antigen has to do with what I call mysterious career paths, and this is something that we haven't talked about as much in this conference. But across science, engineering, and technology fields, we found a surprising lack of clarity around career paths and widespread confusion about what it actually takes to get ahead. Women who participated in our research clearly felt stuck. Nearly half of these women told us they lack career paths, and 45% told us they feel stalled in their careers. Women not only have a hard time finding roadmaps and blueprints, they also have no one to turn to for help, which goes back to the mentor, sponsors, role models issues. One focus group participant told us, quote, "On my own initiative, I put together a one-page development plan. I tried to discuss it with my boss, who told me he didn't have a career development plan either. I then asked his boss, a senior VP, and he said, 'Don't ask me. It's up to you to develop your own path.'" So without those kinds of paths, it's much harder even for women to get ahead, and they don't have those informal networks that help men figure it out. I mentioned the importance of mentors and sponsors earlier. Our survey found that fully 83% of women in SET are without sponsors. Fully 83%. Women described sponsors to us as, quote, "someone who is willing to use up chips on my behalf, someone who has great faith in my potential, or someone who recognized the greatness in me." In our focus groups, women pinpointed the critical importance of a sponsor in helping navigate the promotional hurdles 5 to 10 years into a career when the going gets tougher. One woman who was describing the yawning chasm that faced her at age 35, which is that fight or flight moment, said, "I need someone who can reach over, pick me up, and carry me over." Now, not surprisingly, there's a big correlation between women who lack sponsors and those who are on the verge of quitting. Women without sponsors are 3 times more likely than women with sponsors to be ready to leave. Yet another barrier to women's progress and retention is the risk and reward system that operates in SET companies. What do we mean by risk and reward? Well, in many focus group discussions, SET women described work cultures that encourage a state of crisis and celebrate what we call dive and catch behaviors. You know, that kind of football, like, well, American football anyway, diving to catch the ball that saves the day. But the women also told us that diving catches can be risky. You can, after all, dive and fail to catch and fall on your face. And as one male engineer told us, this is risky business. There are no guarantees in these situations. A person can crash and burn. He then went on to explain that when he attempted a diving catch, he made sure to put in place some cover, a senior colleague who would support him should he fail. Now, precisely because women lack that kind of cover, the mentors and sponsors, as we just discussed, they find it much more difficult, and as a result, they tend to be more risk-averse, more likely to engage in the diving catch behavior because they'll be exposed if it doesn't work out. Almost 1 out of 5 women believe that their managers would never allow them to fail, not even once. They believe that a man can walk away from a risky decision unscathed, while women cannot. So in addition to opting not to make diving catches because of escalated risk, Women also do less to advertise their success. Women told us that they realized they needed to do a better job of selling themselves, something their male peers did on a regular basis. One woman told us that when women talk about their role in a project, they'll say, quite accurately, "I did this much," while a man will say, "I did this much." And because of that difference in behavior, there are different perceptions about what actually gets done and who's doing it. So the forces that keep women from taking risks and from advertising their successes end up pushing them into producer roles rather than creator roles. And this is something that others have talked about earlier today. Nearly half of women working in technology believe that women are pushed into these executor roles and that they do not have equal access to creator roles. Now, we know that creator roles carry the lion's share of status and rewards in SET, while executor roles are seen as subordinate and are often poorly rewarded and certainly less visible. So the execution skills that women bring to the table, things that the people have called them soft skills earlier today, time management, team management, ability to deliver on time, accuracy, and attention to detail, are essential for success, but they've been routinely discounted in SET workplaces. The fifth and final antigen in the SET corporate environment concerns extreme job pressures. And certainly these kinds of pressures are not isolated to SET. But what we found is that while the corporate sector overall has become much more demanding in the past 10 to 15 years, the SET sector is much worse than others. Women face 24/7 client demands. They're often part of global work teams that, once again, require them to work in multiple time zones. And they find themselves routinely putting in more than 70 hours a week at their jobs. Those demands can be crushing, particularly given that women at the key attrition point are often deciding to have their second child and may also be caring for an older parent. Well, so that was fairly bleak. But if there's a silver lining to the cloud that I've just painted for you, it's that many people are beginning to break out of the isolation that's created so much attrition. I'd like to fuel that conversation by describing a few of the approaches that seem to be working for some corporate employers. And the majority of, well, let me just go over this one first before I move on to that, which is to say that the majority of these approaches target the moment before women make the choice to leave. And so this graph shows that if you were to cut attrition by just 25% and have the line go here instead of here, you'd add 220,000, almost 250,000 women to the workforce in the US, in the SET labor market. So the final slide shows a range of initiatives that corporations are pursuing in order to reverse the trend I've described today. And I don't have time to take you through all of these, and some people have alluded to these kinds of initiatives already. On-ramps programs are aimed to get women back into the workforce after they've taken the time off, when many of them do want to come back. And as somebody pointed out this morning, they often don't want to leave for very much time. It's actually a relatively short period of time. Alcoa and Intel are increasing support for women to keep them in technical creator roles. And Google and others are looking beyond traditional backgrounds to recruit from a broader pool. Now, Christina and Judith in the previous session talked a little bit about how we don't have very much research about these initiatives, and that's true. I think in order to claim that these are actually working or examples that people should follow, we really need to know whether they're effective or not and how much they cost. But to conclude, as we've seen, the obstacles faced by women in technology are formidable and institutionalized, and overcoming them will not be an easy task. But the good news is that despite these obstacles, a lot of women are still driven to work in these fields. And so it's really incumbent on us and on the corporate sector with respect to this research, but also in a much broader sense, thinking societally about how to not only attract more women into these fields, but to retain the ones who already have the desire to work in them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.